13, October 1964. New York, CBS Studios. The Ed Sullivan Show, broadcasting live. 63 million viewers sat in front of their televisions. Louis Armstrong was the special guest. But that evening, someone else was in the studio. Richard Morrison, renowned jazz critic, respected music writer. Over 40 years of experience, an authority in the jazz world. And that night, Richard did something nobody expected. While the program was live, while commenting on Louis Armstrong's musical style, he laughed. A mocking laugh. The studio froze. Cameras were recording everything. 63 million people watching from their homes. Louis stood on stage, holding his trumpet. What was he feeling in that moment? Anger, disappointment, shame. His face showed no expression, and he just looked at Richard silently. Ed Sullivan panicked. This was live television, 63 million viewers. This could become a scandal. An argument could erupt. Everyone waited. What would Louis do? Would he respond? Would he argue? Would he walk off stage? Nobody could predict. Because what Louis Armstrong was about to do would silence not just Richard Morrison, but the entire world, with just a few notes. Before we explore this incredible moment of grace under pressure, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. What you're about to witness is one of the most powerful demonstrations of responding to disrespect with pure artistry in television history. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. To understand what happened that October evening on The Ed Sullivan Show, we need to go back several months. We need to understand what Louis Armstrong was experiencing in 1964, because that moment on television wasn't just about one critic's mockery. It was about the culmination of years of criticism, pressure, and Louis's unwavering commitment to responding with dignity, no matter what anyone said or did. March 5th, 1964, 7 months before that television moment. Louis Armstrong sat in his doctor's office in New York receiving alarming news. Dr. Alexander Schiff looked at test results with deep concern. "Louis, your heart is under severe strain. Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated. The stress you're under, the constant criticism, the touring schedule, it's killing you. You need to stop. Completely stop for at least 6 months." At 62 years old, Louis had been performing professionally for over 45 years. The pace had never slowed. If anything, 19. 64 was one of his busiest years. Hello, Dolly had just become a massive hit, reaching #1 on the Billboard charts, beating even the Beatles. At 62, Louis Armstrong was the oldest person to ever have a #1 hit. It should have been a triumph, a validation, proof that his music still mattered, but instead, the success brought a new wave of criticism. Young bebop musicians accused him of selling out, of going commercial, of abandoning real jazz for pop success. Civil rights activists intensified their attacks, said Louis was an Uncle Tom who smiled for white audiences instead of fighting for black liberation. Music critics, especially younger ones influenced by bebop and modern jazz, dismissed Louis's traditional style as outdated, irrelevant, a relic of jazz's past rather than its future. These criticisms hurt Louis profoundly, not because he doubted his talent, he knew his abilities, but because after decades of breaking barriers, opening doors, and fighting racism through excellence, being called a sellout by his own community was devastating. Louis had lived through levels of racism these young critics couldn't imagine, had performed in segregated venues while quietly refusing to accept discrimination, had spoken out against injustice when it could have cost him everything. But because he didn't do it loudly enough, because he smiled on stage, because he entertained white audiences, some black activists dismissed his entire lifetime of work. The stress manifested physically: chest pains, difficulty breathing, exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. Louis's body was breaking down under the weight of impossible expectations. April 20th, 1964. Louis was performing in Chicago when a group of young black students protested outside the venue, carrying signs. "Armstrong sell out. Stop grinning. Start fighting." Uncle Tom, go home. Louis saw the signs as he arrived. Each word felt like a knife. These were his people, young black Americans he'd spent his life trying to uplift through his success. And they were calling him a traitor. That night's performance was technically perfect. Louis played brilliantly, but afterward, alone in his dressing room, he broke down. Lucille found him crying. "Baby, what's wrong?" Louis couldn't speak at first, just showed her a newspaper clipping. A review from a young jazz critic calling Louis's music embarrassingly outdated and questioning why venues still booked has-beens from the swing era. Lucille held him. "Louis, you know that's not true. Your music is timeless. These critics are just trying to make names for themselves by tearing down legends." But Louis wasn't convinced. "What if they're right, Lucille? What if my time has passed? What if I'm holding on to something that doesn't matter anymore?" Those doubts plagued Louis throughout the spring and summer of 1964. Every performance felt like he was proving himself all over again. Every criticism cut deeper than it should have. Every dismissive comment from a younger musician or critic reinforced his fear that maybe, just maybe, his relevance was gone. But we need to understand who Richard Morrison was to fully appreciate what happened on the Ed Sullivan Show. Richard Morrison was 53 years old in October 1964. He'd been writing about jazz since the 1930s, had covered the swing era, the bebop revolution, the cool jazz movement. His opinions carried weight in the jazz world. When Morrison praised an artist, bookings increased. When he criticized someone, venues reconsidered. Morrison had a complicated relationship with Louis Armstrong. In the 1930s and 40s, Morrison had praised Louis extensively, called him a genius, a revolutionary, the most important figure in jazz history. But by the early 1960s, Morrison's opinions had changed. He'd become enamored with bebop, with modern jazz, with the avant-garde movement. Artists like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman represented the future to Morrison. And in Morrison's evolving worldview, Louis Armstrong represented the past. A past that needed to be moved beyond for jazz to progress. Morrison had written several articles in the early 1960s questioning Louis's continued relevance. Not attacking him personally, Morrison maintained respect for Louis's historical importance, but suggesting that Louis's style belonged in museums rather than concert halls. That his continued success was based on nostalgia rather than artistic merit. These articles hurt Louis. Not because Morrison was particularly vicious, he wasn't, but because Morrison's opinions influenced other critics, other writers, other tastemakers. When a respected voice like Richard Morrison suggested someone was past their prime, others listened. September 10th, 1964, Louis received an invitation that would lead to that fateful Ed Sullivan Show moment. The Ed Sullivan Show wanted Louis as a guest. Nothing unusual there. Louis had appeared on Sullivan's show multiple times over the years, but this time there was a twist. Sullivan wanted to include a panel discussion about jazz, with Louis and several jazz critics, including Richard Morrison, discussing the state of jazz music. Louis hesitated. A panel discussion meant potential confrontation, meant critics having a platform to voice their dismissive opinions, meant the possibility of being criticized on live television in front of 63 million viewers. His manager, Joe Glazer, advised against it. "Louis, you don't need this. You're Louis Armstrong. You don't have to justify yourself to critics." But Louis made a different decision. "I'll do it. If people want to criticize me, let them do it to my face, on live television in front of everyone, and I'll respond not with words, with music." That decision would create one of the most memorable moments in television history, but Louis didn't know that yet. He just knew he was tired of being criticized from a distance by people who'd never spoken to him directly. October 1st, 2 weeks before the show, Louis began preparing, but preparing wasn't about rehearsing music. Louis could play anything in his sleep. Preparing was about mentally and emotionally readying himself for potential criticism on live television. He knew Richard Morrison would be on the panel, knew Morrison's recent writings about him, knew this could be uncomfortable, but Louis also knew something Morrison didn't, that his music spoke louder than any critic's words ever could. Have you ever been publicly criticized for something you're actually great at? How did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments. October 13th arrived, the day of the taping. Louis arrived at CBS Studios in the afternoon for rehearsal. The format was explained. First, a panel discussion about jazz's current state. Louis, Richard Morrison, and 2 other critics would discuss. Then Louis would perform. The panel discussion rehearsal was civil, professional. Morrison treated Louis with respect during practice runs, but Louis could sense the underlying tension. Morrison's recent articles hung in the air, unspoken but present. At 6 o'clock, the audience began arriving. The Ed Sullivan Show was legendary. Families gathered around televisions every Sunday night. This wasn't just any television show. This was American culture. Being on Ed Sullivan meant something. Louis sat backstage, warming up his trumpet, running scales, getting his lips ready. His hand shook slightly, not from nerves about performing, he'd performed thousands of times, but from anticipation of what might happen during the panel discussion. At 8 o'clock, the show began broadcasting live. Ed Sullivan's familiar voice welcomed 63 million viewers. The first segments went smoothly, a comedy act, a singing group. Then Sullivan introduced the jazz panel. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we're going to discuss the state of jazz music with some very special guests. Please welcome the legendary Louis Armstrong and distinguished jazz critics Richard Morrison, James Fletcher, and Dorothy Williams. Louis walked onto the stage with the three critics, sat in the arranged chairs. The audience applauded warmly for Louis. Sullivan began with general questions. Gentlemen, lady, what's happening in jazz today? The critics spoke about bebop, about avant-garde jazz, about the evolution of the music. Louis listened quietly. Then Sullivan turned to Louis. Louis, you've been making jazz for over 40 years. What do you think about these new directions? Louis answered thoughtfully. Jazz is always changing. That's beautiful. Young musicians should explore, create new things. That's how the music grows. Morrison saw an opening and made a decision that would define the rest of the evening. But Louis, don't you think there's a difference between evolution and stagnation? Your style, while historically important, hasn't really evolved in decades. You're playing essentially the same way you played in the 1920s. The question was pointed but not overtly disrespectful. Louis could have responded defensively. Instead, he smiled gently. My style works for me, works for audiences. That's enough. Morrison pressed further. But is it? Isn't there a responsibility to push the art form forward rather than repeating the past? And then it happened, Morrison laughed. Not a malicious laugh, but a dismissive, almost pitying laugh. As if the idea of Louis Armstrong having relevance in 1964 was amusing. That laugh hung in the air. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. Ed Sullivan's eyes widened. The other panelists looked shocked. And Louis sat there, silent, looking at Morrison. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, an eternity on live television. Sullivan tried to intervene. Well, I think... But Louis raised his hand gently, a stop gesture, stood up from his chair. The audience held its breath. 63 million viewers leaned forward. Was Louis going to argue, confront Morrison, walk off in anger? Louis did none of those things. He walked to where his trumpet sat on a stand nearby, picked it up, returned to center stage, and without saying a word, brought the trumpet to his lips. What Louis played in the next 3 minutes would become one of the most legendary performances in television history. He didn't play Hello, Dolly or any of his well-known hits. He played something more complex, more sophisticated, something that demonstrated every aspect of his musicianship. He started with a slow, melodic line, beautiful, haunting, the kind of playing that showed his gift for melody, for making every note count. Then he shifted into faster passages, complex runs that demonstrated technical virtuosity, speed, precision, skills that proved his chops were as strong as any young bebop player. He incorporated modern jazz elements, unexpected intervals, sophisticated harmonies, proving he understood contemporary developments even if he chose not to make them his primary style. He played with such emotion, such depth, that several audience members began crying, not from sadness, from being moved by pure artistry. The cameras captured Richard Morrison's face. The dismissive smirk had vanished, replaced by shock, then gradually by awe, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide, watching Louis play with a skill and musicality that couldn't be denied. Ed Sullivan stood transfixed. He'd hosted hundreds of musical performances, but this was different. This wasn't just entertainment. This was a master artist proving his worth to someone who doubted him. The other panelists sat frozen. Dorothy Williams had tears streaming down her face. James Fletcher shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. When Louis finished, the final note hung in the air. Silence for 3 full seconds. Then the studio erupted. The audience leapt to their feet, applauding, cheering, not the polite applause of a television audience, but genuine emotional appreciation for witnessing something extraordinary. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes of continuous applause on live television. Please subscribe if this story is moving you. What happens next shows the true measure of both Louis Armstrong's grace and Richard Morrison's character. Louis stood there, trumpet in hand, not smiling triumphantly, not gloating, just standing quietly, accepting the appreciation. When the applause finally subsided enough for speaking, Ed Sullivan approached Louis, his voice thick with emotion. "Louis, I don't have words. That was the most magnificent thing I've ever seen on this stage." Louis nodded modestly, then did something unexpected. He walked over to Richard Morrison, extended his hand. Morrison stood, his face a mixture of shame and respect. Took Louis's hand. "I apologize. I was wrong." Louis's response was gentle. "You weren't wrong to question. You were wrong to dismiss. There's a difference." That exchange, that moment of grace from Louis, completed the transformation. He'd proven his artistry with his playing, then demonstrated his character with his response. Morrison sat back down heavily, looked at the camera, at 63 million viewers. "I need to say something. I've been writing about jazz for 30 years, and I just witnessed something that humbled me completely. Louis Armstrong isn't a relic of the past. He's a master of the present. I was arrogant to suggest otherwise." The rest of the show continued, but nobody really remembers what came after. That moment, Louis's performance in response to mockery, became the only thing anyone talked about. In living rooms across America, families sat stunned. Parents explained to children what they'd just witnessed. Not just a great performance, but a lesson in dignity, in responding to disrespect with excellence rather than anger, in proving your worth through action rather than argument. The next day, newspapers across America ran stories. Armstrong silences critics with stunning performance. Jazz legend proves doubters wrong on live TV. Morrison apologizes after Armstrong's masterful response. But the most impactful article came from Richard Morrison himself. He wrote a full-page piece in Downbeat magazine titled "The Day I Learned Humility." In it, Morrison wrote, "I thought I understood jazz. Thought I could determine who was relevant and who wasn't. Thought my years of writing and analyzing gave me authority to judge. Then Louis Armstrong played 3 minutes on live television and revealed how little I actually understood, not just about his artistry, which is beyond categorization, but about grace, about responding to dismissal with such dignity that the dismisser becomes the one who looks small. Louis Armstrong taught me more in 3 minutes than I learned in 30 years of criticism. That true artistry transcends trends. That mastery doesn't need to prove itself through aggression, that the greatest response to doubt is simply to be excellent." I apologize publicly to Louis Armstrong, not just for that laugh, though I'm deeply ashamed of it, but for years of suggesting his relevance had passed. Louis Armstrong's relevance will never pass because true greatness is timeless. That article was read by millions, influenced an entire generation of jazz critics to reconsider how they approached Louis Armstrong and other traditional jazz artists. The impact on Louis himself was profound. After years of being told he was outdated, irrelevant, a sellout, this moment validated everything he'd always believed. That excellence speaks for itself, that you don't need to argue with critics, just prove them wrong through your art, that maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect is more powerful than responding with anger. In the weeks following, Louis' bookings increased dramatically, not just from the publicity, but because the performance reminded everyone, including venue owners and promoters, that Louis Armstrong at 62 was still one of the finest musicians alive. Richard Morrison became one of Louis' most vocal supporters. He wrote extensively about Louis over the following years, always with respect, often with reverence. The two men even became friendly. In 1966, Morrison interviewed Louis for a documentary. During the interview, Louis brought up that Ed Sullivan Show moment. "Richard, you did me a favor that night." Morrison looked surprised. "How so?" Louis smiled. "You gave me a chance to prove something I'd been wanting to prove, that my music still matters. That age doesn't diminish artistry. That respect isn't given, it's earned. Your laugh motivated me to play better than I might have otherwise, so thank you." Morrison was moved to tears. "Louis, your grace is as extraordinary as your musicianship." That documentary interview became one of the most watched jazz documentaries of the 1960s, partly because of the music discussed, but mostly because it showed Louis Armstrong's character, his ability to find gratitude even in moments of disrespect, his refusal to hold grudges, his focus on the positive. When Louis Armstrong passed away in July 1971, Richard Morrison wrote a tribute. In it, he referenced that October night 7 years earlier. "Louis Armstrong taught me the most important lesson of my critical career. On October 13th, 1964, on live television in front of 63 million people, he taught me that true artistry cannot be diminished by criticism, that masters don't need to defend themselves with words, that the proper response to doubt is excellence, that grace under pressure is the highest form of strength. I laughed at Louis Armstrong that night, and he responded by playing so beautifully that my laugh became the most shameful moment of my professional life. But he never made me feel ashamed, never held it against me, forgave me immediately. That's who Louis Armstrong was, not just the greatest jazz musician I ever heard, but the greatest human being I ever encountered." Today, the footage from that Ed Sullivan show still exists, occasionally shown in documentaries about Louis Armstrong or television history. When people watch it, the reaction is always the same. Shock at Morrison's dismissive laugh, awe at Louis's performance, and deep appreciation for how Louis handled the situation with such dignity. The moment has been studied in communication classes, conflict resolution seminars, leadership training, because it demonstrates something rare and valuable, that the most powerful response to disrespect isn't aggression or argument, it's excellence, proving your worth through action rather than defending it through words. Louis Armstrong could have argued with Richard Morrison, could have listed his accomplishments, could have gotten angry, could have walked off stage. Any of those responses would have been understandable, but none would have been as powerful as what he actually did. He let his trumpet speak. 3 minutes of playing that said everything words couldn't, that demonstrated his artistry beyond any possible doubt, that transformed mockery into respect, that turned a critic into an admirer, that showed 63 million viewers what true grace looks like. Richard Morrison's laugh that October evening was meant to diminish Louis, to suggest his relevance had passed, to position Morrison as the sophisticated modern critic and Louis as the outdated relic. Instead, it created the perfect setup for Louis to demonstrate something timeless. That real artistry transcends trends, that mastery doesn't age, that dignity and excellence will always triumph over dismissiveness and arrogance. The studio lights dimmed that night. The audience went home. The cameras stopped rolling. But the lesson continued, spreading outward, teaching generation after generation about how to respond when someone doubts you, about the power of letting your work speak, about maintaining grace even when disrespected, about proving your worth through excellence rather than argument. Louis Armstrong stood on that stage, trumpet in hand, facing a critic who'd laughed at him on live television and responded with such artistry that the laugh became irrelevant, the doubt became meaningless, the dismissiveness became embarrassing for the dismisser. 3 minutes of trumpet playing, that's all it took. 3 minutes to silence every critic, to prove every doubter wrong, to demonstrate that Louis Armstrong at 62 was still one of the finest musicians alive. To show the world that grace and dignity combined with excellence create a power that cannot be dimmed by anyone's mockery. Thank you, Richard Morrison, for that ill-advised laugh. Because it created the opportunity for Louis to teach us all something invaluable. Thank you, Louis Armstrong, for responding to disrespect with artistry, for showing grace under pressure, for proving that the best response to doubt is excellence, for teaching us that true masters don't need to argue, they just need to perform. The trumpet rests silent now. The studio has been demolished and rebuilt. Louis and Richard are both gone. But that October night lives on, in footage, in memories, in the lesson it taught. When someone doubts you, dismisses you, laughs at your relevance, you have a choice. Argue, get angry, defend yourself with words, or do what Louis Armstrong did. Prove them wrong through excellence, respond with such grace and skill that the doubter becomes the one who looks small. That's power, real power, the kind that changes hearts and minds, the kind that transforms critics into admirers, the kind that teaches lessons lasting generations. That October night, that dismissive laugh, that 3-minute performance, that standing ovation, that apology, that grace, forever teaching us, forever inspiring us, forever reminding us. Excellence speaks louder than words. Dignity triumphs over disrespect. And true artistry, like Louis Armstrong's, never ages, never diminishes, never becomes irrelevant. It just is, eternally magnificent, timelessly powerful, undeniably great, always, forever.